and welcome back to Black Video Network, folks. And joining us today, we're having a wonderful conversation with Professor Browder. And so, again, I do thank you for being here with us today, Professor Browder. And we are going to continue our fantastic conversation. And so, Professor Browder, I know that we had touched a little bit about your work in Egypt and about a little bit about the timeline between the dynasties and the arrival of the current inhabitants. And so, my question to you is, in doing your work over there and grounding the foundation of ancient Egypt in Africa, have you received any kind of resistance or pushback from the current occupants of Kemit?
Um, to be perfectly honest with you, I've had wonderful experiences traveling to Egypt.
Mhm.
And what I found in Egypt is the same thing that I found traveling throughout the United States or traveling around the world. People are people.
Mhm.
Uh, Generally speaking, people are similar. They have similar desires. They want a roof over their head, food on the table, and the ability to raise their families.
Mhm.
So these basic needs are not unique, right? And
Mhm.
so the relationships that I've had with the Egyptian people have been wonderful relationships. What I've found is that people only know what they know. They
Mhm.
only know what they've been taught. And in my interactions with Egyptians over the past 44 years, Egyptians are just like Americans. They too have been miseducated. Most Egyptians that I've encountered do not know the chronology that I laid out to you and your viewers today. They're not aware of when Arabs came into Egypt and conquered Egypt. They're not aware about the distinctions between the Greek and Roman occupation and when Kemet became Egypt, because they've been educated by the same people who miseducated us, Europeans, the British, the Germans, the French. And so part of what we're dealing with is the erasure of African people from their own history. So in my travels to Egypt, I bring over my books. I bring over books by other scholars. I've been doing study tours to Egypt since 1987.
Mhm.
And what I've done is I train my Egyptian tour guides. What the general rule of thumb is that anyone who tours in Egypt has to have tours, or the daily field trips have to be conducted by a licensed Egyptian tour guide.
Mhm.
And licensed Egyptian tour guides know the European version of Egyptian history. That doesn't sit with me.
Mhm.
I have a broader understanding of the history of Kemet and the history of Egypt. And so I have worked with guides for well over 20 years. My first guide was a brother, an Egyptian brother, who literally was a brother to me. He worked with me for over 23 years before he passed. And I provided him with books that are not available in Egypt, that explain the history of Kemet as I explained to you today. And he took this information and it transformed his consciousness. He was a phenomenal guy before, but he became a better guy after. After he passed, I made contact with a younger guy and went through the same process with him. And as a consequence, his eyes are now open to his own history. And of course, it is a blessing and a curse,
Mhm.
because some of his associates think that he is spreading misinformation. And what we're dealing with, brother, particularly under the current administration, is the suppression of knowledge, along with the suppression of people, the general public. Egypt is going through some dire financial times right now.
Mhm.
The rate of the US dollar to the Egyptian pound is the highest it's ever been. So Egypt could potentially be on the verge of financial collapse.
Mhm.
And so government officials want to be able to maintain the status quo. Tourism is one of the main economic drivers of Egypt. And the majority of the tourists who come to Egypt are non-African, are European, Chinese,
Mhm.
Japanese. And so they cater to um, the knowledge interests
Hmm.
of the people who come. So the type of information that I share with the participants on my study tours is 180 degrees different from the information that's shared with European groups or Asian groups. And that's just a fact that we deal with. It's the same thing that we're dealing with, brother, right here in the United States right now,
Hmm.
where the governor of Texas, the governor of Florida, the governor of Virginia want to restrict the teaching of specific historical information for racist purposes. I'll call it what it is. They want to deny people of African ancestry the right to talk about how our ancestors were treated during the period of enslavement. They want to erase certain information. They want to do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why? Because they want to make America great again, which means they want to make America white again, which means that you have to put black people, brown people, and women in their place so that white men can feel comfortable controlling this country. That's really what it boils down to. And we find the same type of criminal behavior in nations all around the globe. It's not unique to the United States, but it's a form of oppression. It's a form of mental manipulation, which I feel obligated to fight and to use whatever means at my disposal to minimize it, to destroy it. And the best way to do that is by presenting historical and documented truths. The
Hmm.
truth is all powerful in and of itself. Now, whether or not you have a loud enough microphone to put that truth out there is another thing. And in the process of presenting historical truths, you're going to be confronted with historical lies that has stood the test of time for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. You know, case in point, tomorrow is Easter, and Easter is a time frame in which we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus the Christ, right? But what we know, those of us who have studied the history of Kemet, we know that the story of Jesus is not an original story. That story originated in the Nile Valley, is very prominent in Kemet. It's the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru, the first trinity in recorded history. And the story of Asar, Aset, and Heru mirrors the story of the birth of Jesus, the persecution of Jesus, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. But what's important to note is that the story of Jesus is a copy of an African story that had its origins in Kemet at least 4,000 years prior to the story of Jesus. And what I've just discovered within the last 20 years or so is that the story of the African trinity of Asar, Set, and Heru, who we know better through their Greek names, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, that story actually had its origins in Ethiopia. And the Kemetic story and the Ethiopian story are almost identical to the very personalities. But that the Ethiopian story preceded the Egyptian story or Kemetic story by at least 4,000 years. That story is about 10,000 years old. And Ethiopians today still commemorate that story, which is a mythology that was used to inspire and guide the people of the land, which it is a myth which others thousands of years later took and fashioned into a story which they claim is true. But there is no truth to the story if you understand its historical precedents. And that's an interview that we could spend 2 hours on. We don't have time for that today. But once you open that door, you'll find that not only is the story of the virgin birth a story that originated in the Nile Valley, stories of we were talking offline about the Ten Commandments.
Hmm.
You will find that the Ten Commandments, what we refer to as the Ten Commandments, can be found in a document that is over 6,000 years old, that preceded the writing of the Ten Commandments by, in excess of three, almost 4,000 years. It's a document referred to as the 42 Admonitions of Ma'at. As a matter of fact, the American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted got in trouble when he said that the Ten Commandments were derived from the 42 admonitions of Ma'at, and I expanded upon that, and can make the statement that um, that if Europeans or people who profess to be Christians follow just two of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not lie and thou shalt not steal, we'd be having an entirely different conversation. Christianity was used to justify the enslavement and death and destruction of over 100 million African people during the period of the European enslavement of Africans. Pope Eugenius IV issued a papal bull saying that Africans had no soul, thereby allowing Portuguese Christians and then later Spanish Christians and then later still English and German and French Christians to steal African people, to sell them, to rape them, to lynch them, and not incur the wrath of God because Pope Eugenius IV said that Africans had no soul. And what we know through the study of Nile Valley history and culture is that we can trace the origins of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to Nile Valley spiritual traditions. There are religious scholars, there are theologians who know this. I've had conversations with them off the record, but they will not talk about these things in public because of fear of losing their jobs, losing their lives, or losing the pedestal upon which they currently stand and control the masses. So we've been dealing with this issue all of our lives, brother, about the control of information and the use of disinformation in order to miseducate and disempower the masses of people for the benefit of a handful of people who control the resources of nations. So this is nothing new. It's been happening since the dawn of time. And it just so happens that we can find the best examples of the manipulation of the minds and culture and spiritual values of the people. We can find the best evidence of that in Africa, and more specifically in the Nile Valley.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Browder. And so I know out of respect for your time, so I'll give you the opportunity to just go ahead and close out. Is there and talk about your work, your dig, your upcoming dig, and if you want to talk about your tour in DC, and any other information that you wanted to share with our viewers today.
Okay, well, thank you for this opportunity, Caleb. You know, as your viewers can tell, I'm very passionate about this information. It's something that I've devoted over 46 years of my life to. I only talk about what I know. I don't talk about what I think. I don't talk about what I believe. I talk about what I know, and I use documented historical and scientific information to back up what I say. So, of the things that your viewers heard me say today, this is not Tony Browder saying this. This is Tony Browder sharing information that I've read, that I've seen through my own personal travels, information that I know to be sound, and I can back up everything that I say with documented facts. So knowledge cancels out belief, and the world is run by people who access knowledge and know how to use the knowledge for their own personal benefit. So I'm going to be coming to San Antonio for presentations that will be done on the 5th of April and on the 6th of April. I'll be at the Carver Community Cultural Center on Hackenberry Street, where I'll do a presentation talking about the African contributions to world culture and civilization, focusing on the Nile Valley and America. And that's on that Friday evening. And then let me just double check and see if I have a time frame. That presentation on Friday is at 7 p.m. And then Saturday morning, I'll be at the Carver Library, and we'll be screening the documentary on Rkhty, Global Assignment, The Life and Times of Dr. Rkhty. And that presentation, that screening and discussion will be held from noon until 2 p.m. For those of your listeners who may not be familiar with Dr. Rkhty, Rkhty was a brother born in Stockton, California, lived most of his life in Compton, California, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe he lived in San Antonio for a brief period of time. Runoko was a global traveler. He had traveled to over 130 countries, specifically documenting the African presence in the far reaches of the world. He visited museums. He sought out statues and documents that showed a presence of African people around the globe that predated our enslavement. So it helps to set the historical record straight by providing proven, documented evidence to show that African people were the first people on the planet. African people were responsible for developing the oldest documented civilization known to mankind, and the issue of Africans being written out of their own history and culture. So I represent a generation of scholars who are following the footsteps of scholars such as Asa Hilliard, John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, John Jackson, and others who have been presenting this information, documenting this information, preserving this information, and passing it on to ensure that it's not lost. And I'm proud to be able to say that I have made some contributions to this effort. We were going to be showcasing the film of another brother, Rkhty, who also dedicated his life to doing this research. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and we have an activity that we've been doing for the past 38 years, an activity called Egypt on the Potomac. I used a 3-hour study tour where we take people around the city in a bus and we show them the ancient African influences on the layout, design, and development of Washington, D.C. And that activity is conducted. It's a seasonal activity that's conducted between April and November, the first Saturday of each month. Details on how people can participate in the activity can be found on our website at www.ikg-info.com. Uh, we also have been doing annual study tours to Egypt since 1987. Our next study tour to Egypt is July 2nd through the 16th, and details on that study tour can also be found on the IKG website. We open our study tour to anybody who's willing to come and to learn the history of Kemet. That's what we focus on, Kemetic history. So we have our field trips during the day, we have lectures in the evening, and these study tours are designed to help the participants achieve what we refer to as a metamorphosis, and that is a transformation of consciousness that occurs when a person is introduced to accurate historical information about Kemet, the world's oldest um, documented civilization known to mankind, a civilization that was established by indigenous African people. And it clearly shows, the evidence clearly shows what African people were able to do when they were free, when they had control of their destiny. They wound up creating um, architectural, philosophical, religious, and spiritual marvels, which the world is still now trying to understand. And the most important thing about all of this work, Caleb, is the fact that we have also been able to document that there were at least 6 migrations from the Nile River Valley to the Niger River Valley, where Africans in the Nile who were aware of the fact that that civilization was ultimately going to fall because it was continuously being invaded by outsiders, by Syrians, by Greeks, by Romans, by Arabs. And so decisions were made by a select group of knowledge keepers to parcel up certain pieces of the knowledge, scientific information, information on kingship rituals, spiritual information, information on math, science, and astronomy. And that information was parceled up, and at different points in time between around 500 BC and 500 AD, 550 AD, when the last Egyptian temple was closed by Justinian. There were efforts to safeguard this information to keep it from falling into the hands of barbarians. And we can now prove, brother, um, the migration of this information into the Niger River Valley and Africans in Ghana, in Senegal, in Cameroon, in Nigeria receiving pieces of this information, which helped to jumpstart culture in parts of West Africa and allow these West Africans to ascend to develop great cultures and civilization. And we know, based upon the evidence that exists, that the last group of Africans in West Africa to receive knowledge from the Nile Valley were the Africans who live in Mali, who are referred to today as the Dogon. And the Dogon have a cosmology that is related to a star system, a binary star system, which we today refer to as Sirius A and Sirius B, which they refer to as Potolo and Sigitolo, which Africans in the Nile Valley refer to as Sepet. So we can draw direct lines of the migration of African people, African history, and African culture from um, Southern Africa, Central Africa, into Northeast Africa, and from Northeast Africa into West Africa. So if we carry this migration pattern out to its logical conclusion, the Africans, the tens of millions of Africans who were stolen throughout the European enslavement of African people, which lasted from 1444 until 1888. Those Africans were taken from West Africa and brought to the Americas where we were enslaved, right? And so we now have been able to prove genetically through the work of African Ancestry, which is the first and only African-owned genetic testing company, as well as some other resources, from other geneticists. We can now prove a genetic link between Africans living in the Americas with Africans living in West Africa and Africans living in East Africa. We have identified genetic threads that connect all three groups of African people. So my passion for Nile Valley culture and civilization, brother, is encoded in my DNA. And all I'm doing is going home, recovering ancestral knowledge. So the beauty of our Egypt on the Potomac field trip is to illustrate clearly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, how Europeans living in America who established Washington, D.C., used ancient African science, architecture, mythology, and spiritual systems in order to create what has become now the capital of the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. The symbol, which represents Washington, D.C., is a symbol which everybody in the audience can identify as the Washington Monument. But what we show folk on our Egypt on the Potomac field trip is that when that monument opened in 1888, that monument was dedicated not to George, first president of the United States of America, but it was dedicated to Asar, first president and king of ancient Kemit, 6,000 years earlier. The physical evidence is there. We show folk on the field trip. That information is in my book, Egypt on the Potomac. It's in my book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. It is what we refer to as a secret hidden in plain sight. So that monument, which we call the Washington Monument, is known by its Greek name, obelisk. But in the Nile Valley, an obelisk was known as a tekken. And a tekken was a symbol which represented the resurrection of Asar, the first king of Kemet. A tekken is the oldest symbol of resurrection known to mankind. And the story of the resurrection of Asar preceded the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ by a minimum of 4,000 years. So as my friend James Small often says, history erases the mystery. It gives you an understanding of who you are, who you were, and who you have the capacity to become. And when you know your history, when you take pride in your history and spend time teaching your history to others, it changes their consciousness, it empowers them, and it allows you to do the things that God gave us the ability to do from the day we were born. That's real. The reality of that is being offset by governors in Texas, by governors in Florida, governors in Virginia, and school boards around the country that want to ban the teaching of certain information so that they can keep people refined to a certain level of consciousness so that we can continue to be mentally enslaved. And as Brother Asa Hilliard, my good teacher, who was born in Texas, as Asa Hilliard said, mental slavery is worse than physical slavery because a mental slave believes that he or she is free, never realizing that the shackles are on their minds. So my mission has always been to free ourselves from mental slavery, as Bob Marley said, because only ourselves can free ourselves. It's our it's our obligation to our ancestors, it's our obligation to our children and all of our descendants. If you can't fight for your freedom and defend freedom's won, you don't deserve to be free.
Amen. Well, that's a lot. So, Professor Browder, I do thank you. It has been, oh my God, an immense honor and privilege to speak with you today. And I want to thank you on behalf of everyone, Black folks and just everyone everywhere, those who are just seeking knowledge. Thank you on behalf of the ancestors and the future generations. And so we certainly thank you for your work, dear brother. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you for this opportunity. And I hope to meet you next weekend when I'm in San Antonio. And I trust that this interview today will spark the curiosity of listeners so that they will come out to Friday's program and Saturday's program and support the Carver Library Friends of the Carver, and to support the San Antonio Black Film Festival, and support Melanie Eyes for taking the initiative to bring me to Austin so that I can share my knowledge of African history with everyone, anyone who is willing to listen and learn. That's what it's all about.
Well, again, we certainly do thank you, brother. And I
All right.
appreciate
My
you doing
pleasure.
this today.
Okay, my pleasure.
You take care.